I'm here tonight to talk about my new political thriller, which is called The Beethoven Sequence. And, in talking about mystery books or thrillers, the puzzle is always, you don't want to give away too much about the book because you want people to be excited to turn the pages. But I do want to give you a little bit of insight into the plot and the characters. And I don't think I'm giving away too much because what I'm going to read right now is on the back cover of the book. So, there are no surprises there. So this is in a nutshell what the Beethoven Sequence is about. It was as terrifying as it was implausible. Layton Stolz, a humble laborer, concealed a burning core of monomania and suppressed violence. Against all odds, Stolz is swept into the presidency of the United States. Cover-up leads to murder as he consolidates authoritarian power. Ballard Whitmore, a young teacher falsely imprisoned for sexual misconduct, narrowly escapes assassination. Will high-spirited female reporter Sandy Duckworthy's desperate expose laying bare the corruption of a president who lost his grip of reality save him in time? So that's kind of a nutshell about what this thriller is about. And, you might think, well, that's a crazy idea. And it kind of brings up a broader issue of what authors think about when they have ideas about a new book. Because obviously, if you're writing a new mystery or a new thriller, or actually any genre, you want something to be different. You want it to be novel in two senses of the word. So I always start out asking myself the question, what if? And then I let my mind wander, let the question percolate. Then I get to work. And no matter whether it's a mystery or a thriller or a children's story, the first challenge I start out with is how fantastically far-fetched I can come up with an idea, but then craft it in a way that the result seems convincing and almost inevitable. So when I start out, there's nothing that's too crazy. For example, in the mystery series that Willie mentioned, the Daniel Jacobus series, my protagonist is a blind, over-the-hill, curmudgeonly violin teacher. But somehow he manages to be more adept at solving mysteries than even the best law enforcement authorities in the land. Not very likely, but somehow it works, and I'm happy to say that that series is going to continue in the near future with 2 more installments of that. So anyway, let me take a step back and get to where the Beethoven Sequence started. Most of you are familiar with the Suzuki method of violin training. Both Brooklyn and Clyde are musicians, so I'm sure they've heard it. Many of you have probably either studied with it or have had your kids study in that method. Everyone knows about it. It's extremely popular. And one reason is that it's popular is that it's almost a community gathering organization as it is a music training program. So that there are literally millions of people around the world who have been part of this program. And the students and the parents who are involved in it and the teachers are so committed to this and so passionate about this that it's become almost a philosophy of life as much as a music training program. Now, what's essential to this, to the Beethoven Sequence, is that all the teachers in the program are trained essentially the same way, and all the students are taught in essentially the same way. And that's really the key to my book. And it's at this point that I started asking myself the what if questions. I asked myself, what if there was a Suzuki type method on steroids? And what if the leader of this organization became a cult-like figure? And what if this music program became politicized? And finally, what if this program evolved into like the big brother of the 21st century, where truth became lies and freedom became subjugation? And that's where it all coalesced, and I had this idea for the Beethoven sequence. So once I got rolling with this basic premise, the filling in what ifs really began to flow. Like, what if this leader was mentally unstable? And what if he became president of the United States, even though he was a non-ideological political outsider? And what if, as he assumed the power of the presidency, his perception of reality became corrupted and he began to eliminate opponents of his method? And it was at this point where I realized, being a mystery writer, that it was no longer a mystery, it was a thriller. And you might ask, what's the difference between a mystery and a thriller? It's all kind of the same jumble. But there are really significant differences. In a mystery, something baffling happens, whether it's a theft or a kidnap or a murder. There's a puzzle to be solved, and the protagonist uses all the resources he can gather and moves toward the action, trying to figure out how and why the crime occurred, and of course, who did it. That's where we get the word whodunit from. And that's the kind of book that I've been writing with the Daniel Jacoba series. But in a thriller, it seems to me, the action really flows in the opposite direction. You've got an individual with very few resources who seeks to evade capture or death by an oppressive, seemingly invincible power. He or she moves away from the action, hoping to prevail against all odds and hopefully survive. It also seems to me a thriller has an enhanced element of danger to it. So whether it's assassinations or car chases or cliffhangers or intimidation, a Tom Cruise kind of feature to it. So all these things were running through my head, and I had all my what ifs kind of lined up, at which point I really needed to start developing my characters, especially the two protagonists. So I have these two. The main character, whose name I mentioned, Layton Stolz, is this mentally unbalanced wannabe orchestra conductor who becomes a cult figure and then a psychopathic president. And at the same time, we have our hero, whose name is Ballard Whitmore. And he's actually a BYU grad. And he's a young acolyte of Layton Stolz who pays a very dear price for daring to question his mentor's authority. So that's the basic conflict we've got. And all the glue that ties all this together, believe it or not, is Beethoven. And you think, why Beethoven? Well, Layton Stolz is obsessed with Beethoven. And one reason is that they share a lot in common. They both had very difficult, abusive childhoods. They were both social outcasts. They were both outliers and nonconformists. But primarily, for anyone who knows Beethoven's music, so much of his music has to do with liberty and freedom and heroism. And these were characteristics that attracted Layton Stolz to Beethoven's music like a fly to a flame. So much so he became obsessed with Beethoven, started this whole program that he called the Beethoven Sequence. And in the end, it destroyed him because he was so committed to it that anyone who strayed from it did so at their own peril. So I won't go into any more detail than that about the book, but I would like to read you just a couple of character profiles about the two main characters, Layton Stolz and Ballard Whitmore, so you get a sense of what they're like. And when I write about characters, I try to avoid saying, well, he had big blue eyes, he wore a jacket and tie, because that just kind of becomes a list and kind of stock. So I like to get the reader to understand the characters either through the eyes of others or as part of the plot. So first I'm going to read you a little excerpt about Layton Stolz. And in the beginning of the book, he works in a factory, and he has really nothing going on in his life, but he loves this music, and he applies to Juilliard to be in the conducting program, and he gets rejected, which is no surprise. Thereupon, he goes to visit his mother, who is suffering from the last stages of dementia, and tries to explain the situation to her. So I'll just read less than a page. There's a certain irony to the name Prairie View Nursing Home. First of all, any view of a prairie the facility might once have had was now obliterated by 20 miles of suburban sprawl. Strip malls with inexpensive ethnic restaurants, 8-lane freeways, and recently constructed pop-up high-end residential communities. The second reason is that one of its residents, Vivian Stolz, had been blind for years, and so she has no view of anything. She is now also totally deaf. So when Layton tells her about his letter from Juilliard, she has no idea her son is even sitting in a chair next to her bed, let alone any ability to comprehend what he is talking about. But he talks to her anyway, more for himself than for her, more to be able to say out loud what is weighing on his mind. With claw-like hands, Vivian clutches at the top of her blanket with the desperate strength of Wile E. Coyote clinging to a precipice by his fingertips. Both of their endings, Vivian's and Wiley's, are inevitable. Her translucent white skin pulled taut over her cheekbones and a face, immobile as an alabaster statue but for a quivering lower lip, is the Jolly Roger's skull from a toy pirate ship that terrified Stolz in his youth. He wonders what, if anything, is going on inside his mother's head, and as he relates his story of deflated great expectations, a second stream of thought crawls worm-like into his head. If he were to cover his mother's face with his hand for a minute and a half at most, she would be gone. And it would probably be better for both of them. She would probably even be thankful. But of course, he won't do that. He kisses her on the forehead, promises to return next week, says goodbye, and replaces last week's flowers, now wilted, with a new bouquet and fresh water. Spring medley, they called it at the florist. He tries to arrange the bouquet in an artistic way, but fails. What difference does it make? Maybe his mother can at least smell, he thinks. He drives his Granada to nearby Castleton State Forest, and carrying his father's shotgun, walks into the woods for about a mile on frozen, snow-covered ground. He stops when he's sure he's alone, blasts his gun at anything that moves, and goes home. He would not want to be late for work tomorrow morning. So that's a little bit about our protagonist, Layton Stolz. And our other main character, our hero, is Ballard Whitmore, who was a victim of Layton Stolz's revenge. And I won't go farther than that as far as the plot is concerned. But I will read a little bit about Ballard visiting a private detective in order to try to exonerate himself. Let me find exactly where. Okay. Next page. Okay. His detective's name is Stavros Santos. Santos has his office on 500 South, across from the old city library. People in Salt Lake City will know exactly where this is. On the second floor above Ace Bail Bonds. Whitmore feels right at home. The office is almost as seedy as his motel room. Sitting at his desk, Santos is a big man in a small suit. Maybe at one time it fit him, but the Arby's next door is no doubt grateful for Santos's close proximity. With beady eyes like black marbles, continuously scanning, thinning hair close cropped, and an old-fashioned walrus mustache, he could be a gendarme in an Inspector Clouseau movie. Whitmore hopes Santos will be more competent than that. "What may I do for you?" Santos asks, hands folded. His name, appearance, and accent suggest Greek or Balkan ancestry. Santos's grandfather, after whom he had been named, was in fact among the early non-Mormon settlers who made Utah home, emigrating from the Greek island of Corfu to work in the coal mines in the Book Cliffs area around Price. The tales of justice denied to immigrants that he related to his grandson spurred young Stavros on to visions of a career in law. But without the necessary funds for his education, he became a private eye, his alternate route to seeking justice. Not as grandiose, perhaps, nor as lucrative for sure, but it did have its occasional rewards, and it paid the rent. Whitmore provides Santos a concise, rehearsed summary of his situation. It is all truthful, painfully truthful at times, and when it diverges from fact to his personal opinion, he says so. If he is going to scale the mountaintop and take down Layton Stolz, his base camp will have to be on firm ground. "Thank you for the background," Santos says when Whitmore finishes the backstory. "Coffee?" "No, thanks." "I see. Mormon?" "Used to be." "I understand. So what do you want me to do for you?" "I want you to find proof why Heather Hansen lied to me." "And how do you want me to do that?" "I don't know. I'm not the detective, you are." "So, Mr. Whitmore, maybe you've been watching too many movies on Netflix. So let me educate you a bit about what private investigators do in real life, if you don't mind. I'd say a good 75% of our time is spent sitting in a car opposite someone's house with a camera, waiting for a door to open. When the door does open, if it does, we take pictures and provide them to the client, AKA the spouse. Our job is done. What they do with those pictures, whether they take them to their lawyer or show them to their spouse or, God forbid, do something violent, is none of our business. The other cases, the other 20% of the time, we do internet searches, doing background checks for arrest records, back payments, debts, contact information. Most of this kind of stuff any private citizen is capable of doing on his own with a little effort and for about $5, but we don't tell them that. So when you ask me to delve into a closed case that's 10 years old, to search for something that may or may not be there in an effort to bring down a highly popular presidential candidate, you're asking for something somewhat above my pay grade. "What about the other 5%, Whitmore asks. 75 plus 20 equals 95. "Well, the remaining 5% would be lunches, Mr. Whitmore." "Could you just see what you can do?" Whitmore asks. Santos must have heard something in Whitmore's voice. Hopelessness, maybe. Despair, desperation, something. Honesty? "Okay, Mr. Whitmore, I'll nose around, but don't call me. I'll call you. And if I don't find anything, it's on the house. But don't get your hopes up." So that kind of describes Ballard. and kind of describes the situation he's in. And that's the book, Beethoven Sequence. I should sum up by just saying that, this is a thriller, and it's about someone who assumes the presidency of the United States in a very nonconformist way. And some people have suggested it has parallels to our political situation today. And there are some connections there for sure. But the interesting thing is that I actually wrote most of this book long before the current presidential administration. So any connections or parallels are totally in the mind of the reader. But anyway, that's one of the interesting aspects of it. So that's about the book in a nutshell. And I'm happy to take questions and discuss it.
Brooke, Lee, Clyde, y'all ready to go?
Yes.
Yep. Would you like to start or should I?
Oh, do we get to begin, Willie? That would be wonderful.
Go for it. The ball's in your court now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'll start with one of my questions. Let's see. So the issue of bullying seems to resurface a lot as an explanation for this irrational, violent, unethical behavioral response that manifests in Layton and Dwayne Sheely. Are you speaking to this issue as a source of violent, illegal behavior, or are you simply establishing some sort of empathy for the reader?
That's an excellent question. And let me speak generally first, which is that I like my characters to be multi-dimensional. I like my heroes to have some flaws, and I like my villains to have something about them that is not totally negative, that is maybe even endearing. Layton Stolz did have a difficult childhood. Other characters in the book that you mentioned were bullied, and that kind of directed their personalities, or at least their actions, in a certain way. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know that I can say for sure whether this is cause and effect, but certainly our experiences in life make us come to certain conclusions about how we behave and how we respond to other people. And I try to set up a situation where the reader can understand enough of the background of the characters to, if not be empathetic with their motives and their actions, at least understand them.
Thank you.
Sure.
I was wondering, early on in the book, during the first rehearsal between the high school orchestra and Layton, he kind of describes how it reminds him of The Music Man, and things with the teacher there who's a con man, though he makes the difference that he's not a con man later on. Is there any sort of foreshadowing connection there, or am I reading into it?
Well, to tell you the truth, I think that's extremely perceptive. He wanted to kind of separate himself from the Music Man. And I have to say that when I was in high school, I played in the pit orchestra for a production of The Music Man, and it left a very deep impression upon me. I love that musical. And I love when, he tells the kids in the school orchestra, who are just absolutely pitiful, he says, "Okay, fellas, let's think." That's the think method, and he gets them to all kind of scratch away, and the parents just love it. So I think that's what Stolz was alluding to. But I think he really acts from a sense of deep sincerity, and I don't think that sincerity ever really dissipates throughout the book. However, his inner demons do take over little by little. So even though he sees himself as being the purest, the one with the pure soul, the readers and the other characters, of course, see that something really has taken over his mental capacity. Does that answer?
It does, thank you.
Sure.
Let me read one of Willie's. He has some pretty cool questions in here. I think a good one to start with is, what is your favorite piece by Beethoven? Obviously the book's so centered around him, but it's got us all curious.
Oh man. I played in the Boston Symphony for many years, and I played in Utah Symphony for many years. Of the orchestral works, I would have to say maybe the Sixth Symphony. The Pastoral Symphony, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's the least demonic of all his symphonies. If there are two things Beethoven loved in the world, one was this notion of freedom, and the other was nature. And the Sixth Symphony is just all about nature, and it's just so beautiful and so relaxing. And I just love playing it. So I'd say that. But in terms of his greatest music, I would have to say, he more or less changed the course of string quartet writing. And I don't know if any of you are string quartet fans, but he wrote his last quartets in the last years of his life when he was totally deaf. And these pieces are so forward-looking that composers for generations after didn't even seem to come up to that level of foresight. And some of those late quartets, there's one particularly, it's Opus 133, that I believe it's 133, that just fantastic music. So any of the late quartets are spectacular. So highly recommended, and heartwarming too.
Taking another one of Willie's questions, kind of segueing into it from there, can you talk about the relationship between your music and your writing? How do you manage your time between your two crafts and the rest of your life?
Well, a lot of it has to do with deadlines. If I have a music performance coming up, I bust my butt getting ready for that. If I have a writing deadline, I obsess with that. Fortunately, I was in Boston Symphony for a long time and Utah Symphony for a long time, and those schedules are really demanding. So there wasn't a lot of free time to work on books while I was doing that full time. But now, I can do things more or less when I feel inspired or motivated to do them. So, for example, I've got a recording project I'm working on. I discovered this composer from the 18th century whose music is just fantastic, that I'm going to be hopefully recording in the near future. And, so I've been spending a lot of time on that, but at the same time, I've been doing some writing, doing some short stories, just, and I have the luxury of having a flexible schedule. And now that we're all kind of ensconced with this, this COVID business, I've got time on my hands, can't travel, can't do a lot of things I normally would be doing. So, I try to stay productive and do my writing and do my violin practicing. Keeps me busy.
So, moving kind of back to the book a little bit, I was wondering if the instruments some of the characters play, like the two main characters, obviously Layton, he's a conductor later
Mhm.
on, and Whitmore, he plays the viola. I'm wondering if there's any, I guess just being in high school orchestras, there's always a bit of rivalry between every section. Everyone gets lumped in, but I'm wondering if there's any sort of connection between personalities and what people play.
Um, it's funny that you mentioned that because, there are kind of stereotypes that orchestra musicians like to make fun of each other about. Um, Brass players are the outgoing ones. They're the beer drinkers and the partiers and the rowdy ones. Um, violas kind of get the short end of the stick. They're kind of I wouldn't say taken advantage of, but there's a whole body of what are called viola jokes, and I think it's partly, I don't know why, because it's such a beautiful instrument, but it's sort of an ungainly instrument. There's, unlike the violin, the size of violas has never been standardized. So, and the part the violas play isn't often, the part that is immediately audible to the listeners. So they kind of end up on the short end of the stick a bit. But they're also, I would say, among the viola players I know, the most warm-hearted musicians in the orchestra. So, I think it goes both ways. I think violinists are considered a bit high-strung at times, a bit haughty. I don't know. They're all kind of exaggerations, but I don't know. Maybe there's a grain of truth about them. Who knows? How are we doing?
We are doing good. We have a few more questions. Let's move on to one of Willie's. What thoughts do you have about our current political landscape and how your novel provides insight on it? You went into this a little bit by talking about how you wrote most of it before the current presidency, but is there maybe something else you would like to add in between?
Well, there are definitely parallels between the book and the current presidency. Trump is a political outsider, as Layton Stolz was. He had never been in government before. They both have, I would say, unorthodox personalities. They both have a tendency, I would say, to be defensive about their positions and take a dim view of opposition. So yeah, definitely parallels there. But one thing about Layton Stolz is that throughout the book he has this almost unaccountable sense of humility. He doesn't brag about anything. He doesn't talk over people. He listens to people. That might not help him in the end, but there's a humility about him that, despite the things he does, which I won't tell you about in the book, there is sort of a modest, endearing quality to him. So whether you want to compare that to the current president or not, that's totally up to the reader.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
You may have already answered this question in some ways. I just kind of want to get into the thought process a little bit more. What was in this idea of kind of exploitation of power, even despite the different personality types and what's going on with maybe the psyche that we don't get to, understand or experience? Is there something that you intended? Did you intend for us to see this everywhere? We see kind of these things happening in religion. We see it happen with Duckworthy, and I'm just curious if there's this undertone message of that this thing is happening everywhere all the time in every organization and with all types of people.
Now, are you talking about in the book itself or in real life, or?
Yeah, in the book itself, I'm curious if there's an undertone message about this exploitation of power, that it's something that's happening all the time everywhere.
Yeah, well, the book does have this dystopian quality to it. And, I try to avoid presenting any of my books in black and white, that there's either total evil or total good, or, I like the presenting shades of gray. It might not be as satisfying as, watching what's the name of the actor who does all those action films? Just his name escapes my mind. Anyway, I like presenting issues in a way which make the reader think and reflect, and kind of compare it to reality. Now, of course, the book's not reality; it's all fiction, but it does bring up issues which I think are worth reflecting upon. And I think one gets a sense of satisfaction from books that there's clear distinction between good and evil, and I think there's value in that and kind of fun in that. But I like really trying to provide something to the reader that, in addition to being hopefully a riveting thriller, will give one pause to reflect and kind of compare it to real life, and think maybe in a different way about making moral judgments, or thinking that people are who we believe them to be on the surface without really getting to know them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. By the way, Tom Cruise was the name of the actor I was trying to think of.
I'm just wondering some of your own personal inspirations kind of growing up, going into, music and writing. I'm just wondering kind of what kind of inspired you to go into these fields.
Well, I started playing the violin when I was a little kid, and what inspired me was my father saying, "You're going to play the violin." That was it. But I have an older brother and sister who played violin and piano respectively when I was a little kid, and they were kind of my role models for a while, not only in terms of playing musical instrument, but also my brother had all the Hardy Boys mysteries, and my sister had all the Nancy Drew mysteries. So as soon as I was able to read, I was kind of hooked on mysteries, and maybe that's really what got me into this genre. Because when I wrote my first book, Devil's Trill, many years ago, I wasn't sure what genre it was going to be. I just started writing a book about music and wrapping a mystery around it. And at one point, my agent at the time said, "Jerry, you're really going to have to figure out what genre you want this to be." And I said, "Why? Why is that important?" He said, "Because the bookstores have to know what shelf to put it on." And so I thought about it for a while, and I said, I really just am kind of homed in on mysteries. That's what appeals to me to write the most, and it's one of the genres that I really enjoy reading as well. So that's how it went. So both music and reading and mystery started at a very early age, though, I was in the music business for decades before the thought of even writing a book occurred to me. And at first that book was primarily going to be for violin students. It was all about, the challenges of playing the violin and playing music. But over the course of many years, it really morphed into this whodunit called Devil's Trill, and the rest is history.
Great, thank you.
And I should say that, that first book, I had no thoughts about writing a second book. But fortunately, my agent and my publisher at the time wanted a sequel. And that sequel has turned into a series of 6 books so far. And I'm very happy to say there are 2 more books on the horizon. It's called the Daniel Jacobus series. And there's one that'll be coming out in a year or so called Cloudy with a Chance of Murder. And then even after that, one called Murder at the Royal Albert. So I think anyone who's a Daniel Jacobus fan has that to look forward to. And for all of you in Utah, Cloudy with a Chance of Murder takes place on Antelope Island, which is a place that I know and love very well.
Do we got more questions, Brooklyn and Clyde?
I'm just looking in the chat here, and I don't have any more. I think that Gerald covered some of the, the nitty-gritty stuff I was curious about. Clyde?
I have one more question, and I don't want to spoil anything in the book, but there is a point where I would say at least Ireland is involved slightly.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just as someone who's in love with folk music, I somewhat made the connection between the Beethoven Sequence, which is this very strict and like rigid, structured, formatted type of like music, and I somewhat contrasted that with Irish or folk music, which is seen, I would say, more as a very more free-formed type of relaxed thing. I'm wondering if there's any sort of connection between those two.
Well, that would have been a great thing to have in the book. Maybe a scene in an Irish pub. But the reason I chose that location was that I've been there in Kilcrohan, Ireland. And it's sort of this, I chose it mainly because it's such an out of the way, idyllic place. It's not a location where you expect what happens there to happen. But I think you raise a good point, and maybe in the next book I'll have to delve into the difference between classical and folk music, because certainly there's nothing more enjoyable than an evening in an Irish pub listening to Irish folk music. So thanks for the suggestion.
Thank you.